Peace be with you, friends. We are continuing our celebration of the Easter season on this second Sunday of Easter, Mercy Sunday, Divine Mercy. What's mercy? St. Thomas Aquinas says it's compassion in regard to someone else's suffering. So to speak of God's mercy is to say His compassion reaches out to us precisely in our suffering. I want you to keep that in mind as we walk through this extraordinary passage. That's our gospel for this week. It's from the Gospel of John, and it's the account of Jesus appearing, the risen Jesus appearing to His disciples. Look how it begins. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the doors were locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. Move into that fear for a second. We can forget it, I think, too easily. Jesus has just been brutally put to death in this horrific way. His disciples fled. And we get it, they were afraid for their lives. And there they are cowering because they know the next move of the authorities could well be to track them down, crucify them. They symbolize here, everybody, all of us in our fear. So take whatever it is that frightens you right now. What are you afraid of? In terms of your family or your career or your health or whatever it is. And then move into the space of the disciples. They're locked in fear, unable to move. Well, that's all of us to some degree. But despite the locked doors, Jesus came and stood in their midst. The risen Christ, here's the point, everybody. The risen Christ is more powerful than our fear, more powerful than anything that frightens us. That's the good news of Easter, the good news of Christianity. On the cross, we looked right in the face of all those things that frighten us. And in the resurrection, we know that God's love is more powerful than any of those. So He breaks through the locked doors of our fear. He said to them, "Peace be with you." Now behind that, peace be with you in English, eirene in the Greek, and behind it, from the mouth of Jesus, would have come that beautiful word, shalom, which is so central to the Jewish theological and spiritual tradition. Shalom. It means peace, yes, but like full flourishing. It means every type of blessing. Shalom. Shalom. It's what God has always wanted to give His people. And Jesus speaks this word to them. But then we hear this, and this is always the coupling we find in these resurrection narratives. When He had said this, He showed them His hands and His side. In other words, His wounds. Now, this is the combination that's so important to get right, because if it gets out of balance, we're going to miss the spiritual power here. Jesus shows them His wounds. That means He's showing them their own sin. The Lord of life came and we killed Him. That's a basic New Testament insight. The Lord of life, the author of life, God came among us. And you'd say, well, naturally everybody would be overjoyed, right? Everybody would respond positively. Well, on the contrary. What's He met with? Betrayal, denial, hatred, flight. People at best running away, at worst they're nailing Him to a cross. Therefore, in the wounds of Jesus, we see our own dysfunction. And that's exceptionally important. If you start living the spiritual life in such a way that you overlook your own sin, you're going to miss it. We are a salvation religion. There's a Savior who's come to save us from something. If you listen to the voice of our culture, which is always exculpating, right? Oh no, I'm not to blame. Oh no, it's not my fault. It's someone else's fault. It's their fault. No, I'm beautiful in every way, right? I'm okay, you're okay. Everything with me is fine. No, then you're not going to live a healthy spiritual life. The wounds of Jesus are a reminder. They're a judgment, if you want, a judgment on our own sin. But then there's the shalom. Yes, God came and we killed Him. That's how off we are. That's how messed up we are. That's how deep our sin is. And as Dostoevsky saw so clearly in the Brothers Karamazov in that famous scene of the Grand Inquisitor, if Jesus comes back in our own time, we do the same thing to him. Don't pretend, oh no, I'd never do that. I'd never crucify the Lord. I respond to him. No. In the wounds of Jesus, we see our own dysfunction. But then we hear, Shalom. We killed God, but God returned in forgiving love. And that means that nothing can finally separate us from the love of God. Paul saw that, didn't he? Neither death nor life or angels or principalities or height or depth or any other creature could ever separate us from the love of God. This is why. That's how he knows it. Because we killed God. Our sins are on full display. And nevertheless, we are forgiven. Now, remember Thomas Aquinas here. What's mercy? What's mercy? It's God's compassion in regard to those who suffer. See, who are those who suffer but all of us sinners? We see in the wounds of Jesus, in a way, our own woundedness, our own sin. And in answer to that sin, we hear the word shalom. That's the divine mercy. That's the whole of Christianity. Now, watch everybody. As this keeps going, the intensity of this encounter. Put yourself there. You're there in your fear, and Christ has come anyway. He's shown your own sin, but he says shalom. Now, continue. You're there. You're there. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. And then he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. He's been sent into the world as an agent of God's mercy. As the Father sent me, right? God so loved the world, he sent his only Son. The Father sent the Son into the world as an agent of divine mercy. Now, the extraordinary truth, everybody, the extraordinary truth is that same Christ breathes on us. That means he gives us the Holy Spirit and now sends us into the world with the same mission. What if you woke up every day and said, my task today is not primarily to get through school or to get a good job or to make more money or to accomplish some worldly goal? What if you woke up and said, my goal today is to be an agent of the divine mercy, to bring the shalom of God to places where people suffer? There it is. There's the Christian life. There's discipleship. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them. Whose sins you retain are retained. Yes, indeed, this is about Christ empowering the priests of his church to forgive sins in the sacramental sense. That's true, I think. But maybe broaden that out, too, to apply to any Christian. If there's a sinner there in your life who stands in need of forgiveness, and you can be an agent of that forgiveness, well, then they're going to receive the shalom of God. You don't offer forgiveness, you don't offer mercy, they're not going to receive it. You see what he's saying is that so much depends upon us. He's entrusting us with this great mission, this great task. You, right now, in your life, be a bearer of the divine mercy. If you are, people's sins will be forgiven. If you're not, they won't. It's a tremendous privilege and responsibility of all of us in the church. Now, just a few-minute reflection on the next part of the story, which is about doubting Thomas. And I found over the years of preaching, so many people respond to this story of Thomas. Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, hey, the Lord is risen from the dead, he came. And Thomas said, look, I don't buy it. I don't believe it until I put my fingers in the wounds in his hands, my hand in his side. I don't believe it. Here's a first reflection. How come Thomas didn't believe? Well, because he was outside the church. What allows us to see and experience the risen Lord? It's our solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the church. It's staying within the confines of the church that enables you to sense the resurrection. So when the week later he's with the church, okay, now the risen Christ again appears. And he doesn't say that, he doesn't just upbraid Thomas. He says, look, put your fingers in my wounds, put your hand in my side. See, again, it's the instinct for the wounds. It's the instinct for the wounds. In the wounds of Jesus, we see our own sin. So he doesn't discourage Thomas there, he encourages him. I always think here of that marvelous Caravaggio painting that shows Thomas probing the wounds of Jesus. And it's so visceral, it's so physical. But that's the proper instinct, and he encourages it. Thomas comes to believe because Jesus also says, Shalom, peace be with you. Same rhythm, the wounds followed by the shalom. And with that, Thomas gives voice to the greatest confession of faith in the New Testament. He kneels down, that's the sign of worship, and he says, my Lord and my God. I mean, people throughout the Gospels have different understandings of Jesus. He's the prophet, he's teacher, he's healer, even he's Messiah. But it's Thomas who probed the wounds of Jesus and heard the shalom, who gives the greatest profession of faith in the Scriptures. So can I say a word there to the doubters out there? You know, if you're like Thomas, maybe he's a patron saint for you. Okay, don't give up, but allow that doubt perhaps to lead you to a deeper encounter with Christ. And he gives, greater than any of the apostles, greater than anybody, the most profound profession of faith. We're afraid, every one of us. I know, we are. We're like the disciples in the upper room. Don't lose heart. Jesus can come through locked doors and windows and walls. He overcomes our fear. And the way he overcomes it, making us confront our sin. Yes, we're not talking here about cheap grace. You come to terms with your sin. If we're a salvation religion, you got to know there's something you need to be saved from. The wounds of Jesus reveal that. But then the shalom of the risen Christ. That's our redemption. That's our life. That's our salvation. That's our hope. That is the expression of the divine mercy, God's compassion for us precisely in our suffering. That's what this gospel is meant to make us feel. And God bless you. The technology that flows from this more scientific approach to life can result, and there's the Pope's phrase, in a technocracy, that we're now governed by technology.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the senior publishing director. Should we be concerned about our technocratic society, one that's dominated by tech and science, and which in turn seeks to dominate nature? And what can Pope Francis teach us on this topic? Well, that's what we're discussing today with Bishop Robert Barron, who is freshly back in Minnesota from his trip to Washington, D.C. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Bishop, good to see you. It's been a while.
It has, Brandon. Good to see you as always. I'm just getting over a cold, so I hope I don't have too many coughing fits during our time today.
Well, I do want to get into this interesting topic, but we haven't been together in a while. I thought we could briefly update people on 3 different events you recently did. One was the Heritage Foundation, which I think was just yesterday. Is that correct, now that we're recording this in March?
they're running together. I think it was yesterday or the day before.
How did that go?
Oh, it was great. I loved it. I was in Washington for the USCCB meetings, and so they invited me to give the Russell Kirk lecture, and of course I'm a great admirer of Russell Kirk. So I accepted that readily and worked on this talk, several months ago. And it was kind of my reflection on much of this debate going on about the American founding, about Jefferson, Locke, and Hobbes in relation to Catholicism. So I rehearsed some of that business, tried to show a way forward, and talked a lot about the inculcation of objective value. My concern, as I put it in the title, is the breakdown of the Tocquevillian equilibrium. So a liberal society, but that's undergirded by a religious culture. And that's what de Tocqueville saw in the 1830s, was what made America strong was it was a free society with the kind of individualism that was typical of the modern political arrangements. But that was not undercut, it was informed by a religious sensibility, which gave it its soul. So I'm asking the question, what do we do now when so much of the religious structure is fading away and are more unsavory elements of the American political arrangement asserting themselves? That was kind of the burden of my argument.
You can watch the whole talk online. It was recorded and put on YouTube. I'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes. Another really interesting thing you did was sit down with Brett McKay from the Art of Manliness podcast. The Art of Manliness is one of the largest men's websites and podcasts in the world. And he wanted to speak with you about Dante. How did that conversation go?
I loved it. You and others have told me about his podcast. I didn't know it that well. I liked him a lot. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. I love taking off from Dante, whom I've been teaching for years and studying. But to do it in terms of the relationship to fatherhood and masculinity, the call of men in our society, to go on this spiritual journey of courage, and of moral demand. So I thought that was a very useful conversation, yeah.
And I'll link to that one as well in the show notes. Third and finally, you had a discussion with our old friend Alex O'Connor. You've talked with Alex a couple times. Alex, for a while, had a YouTube channel called The Cosmic Skeptic. He was one of the most popular atheists on YouTube. I think he has hundreds of thousands of subscribers. He started kind of a new spin-off show. I think it's called Within Reason. And he brought you back for another long-form discussion. How did that one go?
Good. Yeah, that was recorded here at my house, several weeks ago now, I guess, but I just appeared. I was glancing at some of the comments. Of course, there's a lot of comments already, well over 2,000, I think, But they were a good mix of, people that were very appreciative of the conversation. There were religious people, and then, more his usual audience of skeptics and atheists. And I thought the comments were good, predictable to some degree. But I enjoyed talking to him. I always have. And there was he just used a different style or a different format this last time. Seemed more kind of curious about, the religious point of view, and he wasn't in a polemical mode so much, but a more curious, investigative mode. So I thought that was interesting, helpful.
Well, let's shift now to the topic of our discussion today, and it's the theme of technocracy. You've read all the encyclicals of Pope Francis, many of his exhortations, as have I, and one of the major themes you discover in there that I don't think has gotten a lot of coverage is his emphasis on the danger of technocracy. You see this especially in the 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, which got a lot of emphasis because of its teachings on the environment. But in that encyclical, he coined the phrase, the technocratic paradigm. In fact, he used that phrase 5 times in the encyclical. Here's what he says, I'm going to quote him. This paradigm exalts the concept of a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object. It can be said that many problems of today's world stem from this tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. All right, lots of big words there, so help unpack that for us. What exactly is he getting at? What's the technocratic paradigm that he's concerned about?
I would invoke the name of someone we've talked about before, a very influential figure in the life and thinking of Pope Francis, namely Romano Guardini, who, despite that lovely Italian name, was German in formation and culture, very influential thinker. Think of someone like Karl Rahner, very influenced by him, as was Urs von Balthasar, as was Karol Wojtyła, as was Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And one of Guardini's great insights, he had a lot of them, but one of the great ones, and you'll see it in his letters from Lake Como, is the shift from a more, I'd call it contemplative, cooperative mindset in regard to nature to a more aggressive and domineering approach to nature. Now, like many others, he saw this as arising from philosophical modernity. I think of two key players. One is Francis Bacon, the other is René Descartes. Francis Bacon, who said, we need to put nature on the rack and torture her until she reveals her secrets to us. Well, that's called aggressive experimental science that is going to interrogate nature even violently so she gives up her secrets. And then René Descartes, who famously says the purpose of philosophy is to master nature. And now, as I've said many times, thank God for these people in a way, because they gave rise to the sciences and technology that we benefit from. So all that's true, and I think the Pope would agree with that. But there's a danger, and many saw it from the beginning. Remember one of my great heroes, Blaise Pascal, younger contemporary of Descartes, and one of his pensées is simply Descartes inutile, Descartes useless. That many from the beginning saw the danger of this modern shift, is that I'm in a cooperative, contemplative relationship with nature. I'm trying to control it. I'm trying to master it. Now, the technology that flows from this more scientific approach to life can result, and there's the Pope's phrase, in a technocracy, that we're now governed by technology. Technology has a domineering relationship to nature. What makes my life more pleasant, that's what matters. So if it gets me there faster, it makes my life more convenient and comfortable, well then who cares about, and I'll use the Pope's term, all the filth that's produced in this process? Who cares about the damage being done to the environment and to nature? Who cares about the damage being done to my own body and psyche in this process? Think of something we've talked about a lot, which is the way the social media have come to dominate us in rather unhealthy ways. In taking this position, the Pope, and people misread him here as he's some kind of crazy-eyed liberal. Not that. He's in the tradition, going back to people like Pascal, of suspicion of this modern term. Not rejection of it, mind you. That would be a sort of, Luddite point of view. It's not a rejection of it, but it's a cautionary attitude toward the way science and technology come to dominate life, nature, and our very bodies. And I've argued, Brandon, for a long time, that's the key to understanding Laudato Si. If you see it, the Pope's global warming encyclical, well, that's such a reductive, simplistic reading of it. I would call it's this sort of Pascalian, it's a Guardinian, it's an anti-modern, if you want to put it that way. It's an anti-modern encyclical. That's what he means, I think, by the technocratic paradigm.
Let's talk more about Romano Guardini, the Guardinian. I like that term.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that before. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis cites Guardini 5 times. He did his doctoral work on Guardini. I think he didn't quite finish it, but he studied him extensively. One of Guardini's most famous books from the 1920s was called Letters from Lake Como, Explorations in Technology and the Human Race. And it's, again, a series of letters. One of those letters, he reflects on the images of homes and boats around this Lake Como, using it as a metaphor for the technocratic paradigm. Talk about that metaphor and what he was trying to communicate.
He noticed the shift when he was a young man. He went to Lake Como, as a lot of Germans did, by the way. They liked to vacation in Italy because of its beauty and warmth and all that. And Lake Como, one of the loveliest places on the face of the earth, north of Milan. Country that Augustine would have known, by the way. So when Augustine was living in Milan, in the ancient times. Casasiacum, his kind of philosophical retreat was not far from Lake Como. So it's kind of a beautiful, charged area. And Guardini noticed when he was a young man, the buildings seemed to move with the rhythm of the landscape. They weren't in aggressive contrast with it, but they were respectful of its own kind of rhythms and patterns. The same, he said, with the way boats, and think now of, pre-motor boats that were more like just steered by a rudder and a sail and so on, that they were almost compelled to follow the rhythms of the sea. What he noticed was, as the modern technocratic paradigm was taking hold more and more, buildings became sort of indifferent to the environment, had their own kind of aggressive place within the environment. They weren't respectful of the landscape of the place. And then he saw the motor boats that were emerging, just racing their way through the water, indifferent to its own rising and falling and swelling and so on. Getting us there faster, undoubtedly. Homes maybe embodying our sense of what's beautiful, yeah, probably. But disrespectful of nature in both cases. And he felt that we had lost something of that contemplative attitude that had been dominant since the time of Aristotle. For Aristotle, the point of the sciences, not to master nature so much, but is to contemplate the natural forms. Anyway, that's a very telling example of this shift that Guardini was bemoaning.
In the last century, Guardini was not alone in expressing concern about technocracy. Two great literary masters, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, also rang a similar alarm in their writings. Lewis did it most prominently in The Abolition of Man and its fictional parallel, his novel That Hideous Strength. And then Tolkien did it through The Lord of the Rings. Can you say something about Lewis and Tolkien's discomfort with the technocratic paradigm?
Yeah, they shared very much this Guardini perspective. And I want to put it in this broad, it goes back to the earliest critics of modernity, like Pascal. Think of Goethe as well, 18th century, the great German literary master, kind of in many ways, the Shakespeare of the German language. Goethe saw the same thing. He was at war with Newton. The Newtonian science was becoming dominant at that time. And Goethe was very concerned about it because of these aggressive, the dominance of the subject over the object. Goethe wanted to recover this contemplative, respectful attitude toward nature, allowing nature to reveal its secrets, not to torture the secrets out of nature. Well, look at someone like Tolkien now, and I have in my mind those images of Saruman, right? And the devastated, blasted country around him, the trees having all been eliminated, as he's producing armaments and these artificial creatures, right? He's sort of creating through his own will and power something that's wrecking nature, destroying nature. He's becoming more and more powerful, but also more and more monstrous himself, and morally objectionable and dangerous as he does it. Think of the Ents, in Tolkien, these ancient, and the fact he calls them Ents, it has a sense of primordial beings. These trees that actually can speak and could walk. I mean, they're alive, but they're being so violated by this aggressive technology. He would have seen that as a sign of the capitalism, the sort of industrial capitalism that was taking hold. Now, you want to go back a little further in English literature, look at someone like William Blake, would have had the same complaints, right? How the countryside was being besmirched by factories and smoke and all of that. So I think they are very much right in that Guardini, and they're contemporaries. They're acting and writing at the same time. Lewis, of course, who was on to all these great trends. Lewis, who was, people forget, trained in philosophy originally. That was his natural interest in a book like Abolition of Man, which is a highly dense philosophical text. Some readers of Lewis I know are put off when you say, read the Abolition of Man, because it's a text you really got to spend time with and work with. But great interest in literature, of course. and in apologetics, but his beginning point was philosophy. So he was aware of all of these trends that we've been talking about and came down strongly on the side of the Guardini perspective.
Listeners who have not yet read Abolition of Man, Word on Fire actually has a really good companion volume written by Father Michael Ward called After Humanity. It's a detailed commentary and introduction to Abolition of Man, and it comes with a free copy of The Abolition of Man. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes as well.
You know, maybe a note here, Brandon, as we talk about this, and with Pope Francis having just had his 10th anniversary as Pope, there's a very tendentious, caricatured view of Francis as this, just kind of wild-eyed liberal, post-Vatican II liberal. But see, what we're trying to show here, at least we did it obliquely, is that he's coming up out of a very rich and complex philosophical tradition. And the figures we've been talking about, from Pascal to Lewis and Tolkien and Guardini, these are hardly standard bearers for post-conciliar liberalism, right? These are all, you might say, very conservative figures. I don't like those terms at all, but at least it complicates the picture of someone like Pope Francis, to say, he's a liberal because he's against global warming. Well, I mean, what a reductive, simplistic reading of these complex philosophical trends that are in him.
I think it's worth adding, too, that these figures we're discussing, Guardini, Lewis, Tolkien, Pope Francis, who are ringing the alarm bells about technocracy, are not Luddites. They recognize the value of technology and science, but they're concerned about the direction in which it could go if it was unconditioned by ethics and morality.
Yeah, quite right.
All right, let's turn back to Pope Francis and Laudato Si. Again, he says that while technology and science have undoubtedly improved the quality of life in significant ways, and now I'm going to quote him here, there is a tendency to believe that every increase in power means an increase in progress itself, an advance in security, usefulness, welfare, and vigor, as if reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power as such. The fact is, he says, that contemporary man has not been trained to use power well because our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility, values, and conscience. Each age tends to have only a meager awareness of its own limitations. It is possible that we do not grasp the gravity of the challenges now before us. The risk is growing day by day that man will not use his power as he should. So here the Pope warns that contemporary man has not been trained to use power well, but where do we get this training? How can we learn to use technology well?
Well, I mean, first a word about power, because that's a very important insight. And you point to Nietzsche, as I've often done, and he's in many ways the master of, the power, the will to power. But see, behind Nietzsche are figures like Bacon and Descartes, where Descartes says it's mastery over nature that we want. That's a power. In fact, it was Francis Bacon himself who said, knowledge is power. See, Aristotle would never have said that. For him, knowledge is a type of contemplation, right? It's a kind of reverence. But with Bacon, you have a revolution, because knowledge is now power. I use it so I can exercise power. Now, again, mind you, to make lives better, all that's great. No one wants to do away with that. But if the primary reference is power, then I do lose the moral framework for that power. And then it does become very dangerous indeed. Now, lots have reflected upon this, and I'm not going to be casting all this moral blame on Bacon and Descartes, but from that move of knowledge as power and mastery over nature, undisciplined by anything like a broader moral vision, what you get is, heck, I'm going to use technology to accomplish anything that I want. The fumes of the gas chambers now. What did Hitler do but use technology in a way that devastating moral consequences? It's because it was technology utterly divorced from a moral framework. Now, just to be, in the interest of fairness, dropping atomic bombs on populations that killed upwards of 100,000 innocent people, the use of technology, but undisciplined by a moral sensibility. So the Pope is dead right, it seems to me, about that. Now, where do we get that from? We get it from this tradition, which has been too often occluded by this hyper stress on science and technology and power, right? So, I mean, why don't we have the capacity to think deeply about moral issues? Because we've seen that as, oh, it's trivial, it's subjective, it's just, that's your cultural consensus, it's don't impose your values on me. Well, that's been a disaster, because if that's all set aside, all that's left, in fact, is our power to make our lives more convenient, comfortable, and so on. So he's absolutely right about that. And to see power as equivalent to the good life, no, it's not at all. Power is like a tool. You can use it for good or for ill. It's great to be powerful as long as that power is directed according to the path of love and justice. Then off you go. Use it all you want. But bracket love and justice or subjectivize them or relativize them. Now you become very dangerous indeed, the more powerful you become.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have a question from a man named Brian. He lives in North Carolina. He graduated from a prominent Baptist seminary, but converted to Catholicism in large part through Bishop Barron's YouTube channel. And he's got a question comparing Protestantism to Catholicism. So here's Brian.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Brian, and I'm from Raleigh, North Carolina. I graduated from a prominent Southern Baptist seminary, but converted to Catholicism thanks in part to your YouTube channel. Many of my Protestant friends are simply indifferent to my conversion because they believe the true church is invisible, made up of believers from all different Christian denominations. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on this dichotomy of the visible and invisible church. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And it's a key issue in the Protestant Catholic debate. I'll make a simple observation here, and we can unpack this for the next, 6 months. We could. The link between the people we were just talking about, René Descartes, who bracketed so much of the external philosophical tradition, he bracketed the external world of the senses, and found the ground for his certitude deep within him, the cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and then brought all of reality to the bar of his subjectivity for adjudication. The subjectivism and the internalization of the process. Many pointed out over the years the link between that move and one that was done not too long before it in the religious order by Luther. Luther overthrew so much of the visible church, if you want, found his justification in an inner experience, of being accepted and receiving grace and so on. Justification by grace through faith. And then you're right, an ecclesiological implication of that is the true church is made up of all those people all over the place. Protestant, Catholic, they could be ostensibly atheists or whatever. They could be in a church, out of a church, Bible believing, but as long as they've made this move in their own interiority, they belong to this invisible community of the saved, right? Well, see, Catholicism has always stood athwart that view because, as Aquinas would probably say, it's because we're not angels. We're bodies and souls. And so we don't think it's the case that salvation primarily is happening in here, in some inner space. But the Lord addresses us in our bodies and through our bodies, and we live out the life of faith. We grow in sanctification precisely in relation to the visible church, which means the church in its institutional structures and in its sacraments and in its saints and in its great works of art. And so we've resisted that tendency to find the invisible church that's hidden kind of among or under all the external forms. Just as my soul, that's not like the real me hidden deep down in here somewhere. No, this is the real me, too. I'm body and soul. And so God addresses both body and soul, and I'm saved in both body and soul. Okay, that's a simplistic answer, I know, to a really complicated question, but that's just one angle on it.
Thanks for your question, Brian. If you have a question you'd like to send in to Bishop Barron, do so at the website askbishopbarron.com. As we close here, I want to talk briefly about Word on Fire's Liturgy of the Hours books. Nearly 30,000 people now subscribe to these monthly books, which allows them to enter into morning, evening, and night prayer, the prayer of the church. If you've been on the fence about subscribing yourself, now's the time. Because the limited founders discount is ending soon, and this is your last chance to lock in this price. If you sign up before March 31st, 2023, which is just a few days from now, then you'll lock in the price of $7 per month. However, after March 31st, the price is going up to $9 per month, thanks to increased shipping and printing cost, inflation. We all know the numbers. But if you subscribe now for $7 a month, you lock that in and keep that price moving forward. So again, learn more and find out why this prayer can change your life, can deepen your prayer life in new ways. You can learn more at wordonfire.org/pray. That's where you can sign up. And again, do so within the next few days so that you get this founder's discount price. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the